friends, and welcome to Bad Book Club, where I, Jade, a silly goose with an English degree, read classic and popular literature so you don't have to. Hello everybody, and welcome to this week's episode on To Kill a Mockingbird. I actually really enjoyed this book. I never read it before now. It has never been required for me to read it in school, and it never came up, and it always sounded like, honestly, a little boring, so I just never read it, and it was much better than I thought it would be. It was a really enjoyable read. I can't wait to hop into it, so without any further ado, let's jump into some information about Harper Lee. So I never like to do too much research about the book before I read it because I like having unfiltered, thoughts and opinions about it before I look up information. And every time I look up information, I'm always surprised, and it's always useful to know. So in this case, what surprised me is that this book was published in 1960 by Harper Lee, and it's actually kind of based on some experiences that she had when she was a child in 1936 or something. Her dad was also a lawyer like Atticus, and he also represented some Black members of the community in her tiny town. So I didn't know that, and it tracks because this book felt really well done to me in terms of its portrayal of small Southern life in the 1930s from the eyes of a white little girl. So it was super interesting, and honestly, the most that I know about this book is that it was published in 1960. It was a huge deal. Harper never thought it'd be such a big deal, but it was. And another fun fact that I know is Harper Lee was really good friends with Truman Capote, who wrote In Cold Blood. The story is essentially about a little girl named Scout, or Jean Louise, but she's called Scout, and her brother Jem and her father Atticus living in Maycomb. She describes the events of a couple summers leading up to one summer where her father represented a Black man named Tom Robinson accused of raping a white woman in town. Now, this discussion will include some, explanations of what happened. So if you aren't a fan of those subjects, just skip past those parts. Mostly we'll get into it in the trial scenes. So I have a lot to get to today. Why don't we just hop in? Let's go. The book starts off with Scout telling us her brother Jem broke his elbow when he was 13, and that the way it all started was the summer they met Dill, and when they started being interested in a man called Boo Radley. She talks more about how her family, the Finches, came to be in Maycomb and how they lived at Finch's Landing and they made their money from cotton and all that jazz, and then they moved to Maycomb about 25 miles away with her father when they were younger. She mentions that it is around the 1930s, FDR is a thing, and the Great Depression is happening. It is occurring. She talks about her cook, Calpurnia, and they also mention Dill, a little boy of 7 who comes to town to stay with his aunt, and how she and Jem, her brother, befriended him. She talks about how Dill became really fascinated with this character called Boo Radley. She talks a bit about how the Finches came to be in Maycomb. They used to have a place called Finch's Landing where they did cotton things, and that's how they made some of their money. But her father Atticus moved them to Maycomb, around 25 miles away, where he is a lawyer. She mentions that Jem is about 4 years older than her, so I'm assuming she's around 6 right now at the start of the book. And she mentions that Dill came into town. He is a boy around 7 who has become very interested in Boo Radley. Who's Boo Radley, you ask, and why does his name sound kind of cool? He's actually a very spooky character to the children. It's a very urban legend kind of feel. The legend goes that Boo was once a teenager and partook in some tomfoolery, and his father sentenced him to life inside the house. And then later in his life, there's a theory that he once stabbed his parents with some scissors and therefore is now always required to stay at home. His father still lives there and walks by the street, but Boo never comes out, and so they aren't even sure if he's still alive. At the end of the very first chapter, Dill dares Jem to go and touch the house. Jem does it, nervously. Scout notices that the curtains in the windows seem to flick a little bit. Next, we skip to Scout's first day at school, first grade. She's super excited, and she goes to class, and her teacher says, who recognizes these words on the board, who can read them, and Scout says that she can. She reads the words out loud, and the teacher is upset. She's mad. Her name is Miss Caroline, and she tells Scout that she should not be reading at home, that her father Atticus should not be teaching her. Scout responds with, okay, but no one taught me. I just feel like I've always known how to read. Like, no one actively teaches me how to read. And the teacher's like, okay, well, tell your dad to stop. I'm not interested. He's teaching you wrong. And so Scout's already in hot water on her very first day. Things just keep going downhill because later that day, Miss Caroline asks everyone to raise their hand if they have lunch. Walter Cunningham doesn't raise his hand. The teacher offers him a quarter for lunch and he refuses it, and the teacher isn't sure why. So Walter asks Scout to tell the teacher. I guess that Scout's been kind of naturally chosen to be a spokesperson at this point. And so Scout tells Miss Caroline that he's a Cunningham, and Miss Caroline doesn't get it. And she says, well, he's a Cunningham. They don't take anything that they can't pay back, and he can't pay you back. Scout recalls the time that Atticus helped out the Cunninghams, and when they couldn't pay, Scout said, well, what are they going to pay us with? And Atticus said, don't worry, they'll have paid us by the end of the year. And throughout the year, the Cunninghams left them gifts like holly and greens and nuts and all that, and he was right, they were paid off. Remembering that, Scout tells Miss Caroline that she's shaming him. He doesn't want the quarter. And Miss Caroline is pissed and has Scout come up to the front of the class and does that ruler thing on the kids' hands that used to be a thing in schools like a dozen times. And Scout is really upset and they all leave and Miss Caroline looks really down. And Scout mentions she'd feel worse for her if she wasn't so mean. So far, some of my first thoughts on the book is that it's going okay. Honestly, the beginning is a little boring. The first couple pages are a lot of family lineage and history and all that, and it's a little boring. It's a little hard to get into. And I could understand why, if you were required to read this for school and the beginning is boring like that you would have trouble getting into it, because I had trouble getting into it and I was just reading for fun. So I understand why, but chapter 2 is much better than chapter 1, in my opinion, because we're at school and the teacher is not cool at all. And we get a feel for more of the characters. I like Jem. I like Atticus, who seems to have the right thing to say for every situation. And I like Scout, who seems like someone is actually a kid. Unlike Wonder, where August's voice didn't quite match his age, in this story, it's almost like Scout is telling us something that happened to her like a really long time ago. So I feel like a friend who's 20 is telling me the story of when they were 6. And so it feels more accurate because while she's using an adult voice, she still has childish circumstances and it feels really real. So I'm liking it, but it is a little slow. The first part of the book, spoiler alert, is a little slow. It's important though, so we're going to keep talking about it. And honestly, I might move fairly quickly because like I said, it's mostly introducing us to the setting and the characters and her life and the town. And I'll get that all across to you, but really it doesn't get spicy till part 2. So I want to get there. Anyway, after that debacle, they are let go to lunch and she's beating up Walter in the yard when her brother Jem is like, what are you doing? Stop beating him up. And instead, Jem invites Walter to go with them to lunch. And Walter comes and they have lunch. Scout laughs that he puts like a ton of syrup on his food, and Calpurnia gets really upset at her for like mocking someone who's their company and someone who has less than them. And then they walk back to school, where somehow the day gets even weirder for Scout. Back in class, Miss Caroline starts screeching at something and pointing at a kid. She says that something crawled out of his hair, and he calls it a cootie. Googling this, I cannot figure out what she was referencing. Is it lice? Is it like a roach? I have no idea what's in this kid's hair, but something gross and alive was in this kid's hair, and he doesn't seem concerned about it, but Miss Caroline is very freaked out, and all the kids are like, don't worry about it. It's at this point that a little kid named Burris stands up, and he's like a super dirty kid, and Miss Caroline tells him, like, go and wash yourself at home. And he says, no. And also, I'm not coming back. And she was like, what are you talking about? He's like, this is my first day. I've come to 3 first days and I never come back. His name is Burris Ewell, and he basically makes Miss Caroline cry and then leaves. So that's not the weirdest thing ever. And that night, Scout tells Atticus that she's really sad because Miss Caroline said she can't read with him at night anymore. He doesn't even read with her. They like sit in a room together and read, which is like the cutest thing ever. In this conversation, Scout tells Atticus how much she hated school and how Burris doesn't have to go, so why does she have to go? And Atticus says, the Ewells are not someone you want to follow the example of. They've been a disgrace to this town, and they get certain things that other people don't have to do because we just expect less from them. And he mentions that they live in like a really terrible situation with like no money near the dump, and it's really embarrassing for everyone. And he says, you don't want to be them. Like, you are better than that, and you should expect more from yourself. So you're going to go to school. However, we can still read together. And Scout says, all right. The next couple of chapters are about Boo Radley and Radley Place. Jem and Scout have to walk past Radley Place in order to get to and from school. And one day, Scout's walking home and she sees something in this hole in the tree. It's a piece of gum. So she puts it in her mouth and she's chewing it and goes home. Jem freaks out because everyone knows that those trees at Radley Place are poisoned and makes her spit it out. But then later in that week, they find some coins in there. And the kids are unsure if someone is just using this as a hidey hole or if these gifts are for them. No matter, they'll just keep the coins anyway. And later in this chapter, Dill and Jem roll Scout in a tire and it lands in Radley's yard, and she runs away and she feels like she heard laughter. Scout tells us that she is sitting with Maudie on her front porch. She is her neighbor, Miss Maudie, and that they're talking about Radley Place. Scout asks her if she knows anything about Boo Radley, if any of the urban legends are true, and Miss Maudie says no, they're not true, and his name isn't Boo, it's Arthur Radley. And the reason he stays inside all the time is probably because he's a foot-washing Baptist, which she explains as thinking any pleasure is sin. And she says maybe that's why he stays inside. Miss Maudie is really cute. She seems really real. She loves her garden and that kind of thing. So far, I think that Lee is a really great characterization writer. So all her characters seem really real, really fully formed. They all have lives outside of what's going on. I think that's really well done because when you're a kid, everyone has lives that you don't quite understand. And Scout's like that throughout the whole book. She doesn't quite understand everything that's happening. And she's just trying to figure it out, which is very relatable for being a kid. I do think, like I said, the beginning of the book is a little slow moving. They're just acting out plays and touching Boo Radley's house, but don't worry, stay with me, it's going to get more interesting. After her conversation with Maudie on her porch, Scout learns that Jem and Dill want to send Radley a message on a fishing pole through his window, because that sounds like a great idea. So they set that up. Dill gets a bell to ring if he sees anyone, and they're trying to stick this note through the window when Dill starts ringing the bell, and they turn around and see Atticus just standing there staring at Dill while Dill furiously slams on the bell, which is so funny to me in that image. But Atticus is very disappointed and tells them to leave the poor man alone and to just go home. It's also very clear that he knows about a play that the kids have been doing about Boo Radley. They just have been like pretending to be Boo Radley, kind of like House, and Atticus definitely knows about that. It's very spooky, very parent, where like parents seem to know everything. Very accurate. Some time passes, but not a lot of time, and Dill and Jem think of something else. This time, we're going to walk up to the house and peer in through a window and try to see Boo Radley. This, obviously, is going to go great. Anyway, at the dead of night, Scout wasn't aware this was a thing. She thought they were just going on a walk, but they're like, look, we're going to sneak by the house and see if we can see him. Jem and them sneak in. Jem walks up to the window, and a figure comes out onto the porch with a gun and starts shooting at Jem. They all run. Her and Dill get way ahead and realize that Jem is a little further back because he lost his pants, which is pretty funny. They got caught on something and tore, and he just took them off. And so they circle around, and now there's a growing crowd outside of Radley's place. I neglected to mention this before, but there is another person who lives at Radley. It's Nathan Radley. And he, I think, is supposed to be the brother. The father died sometime at the beginning of the book, and people were like, wow, he was super mean. And then his brother moves to town, takes over the same role, where he walks around and doesn't do much. Anyway, Nathan is standing there saying, someone tried to break in, and I shot at him, and I don't know if I hit him. And the crowd's like, whoa. And then they all realize that Jem doesn't have any pants on. And Atticus is like, where are your pants? And Jem and Dill make up this story about how they were gambling and playing strip poker. And Atticus says, look, we're not gambling anymore. Unacceptable. And they go to bed. Later that night, Scout and Jem are laying in their rooms, and she realizes that Jem is going to go and get his pants because otherwise they'll know it was him. So he travels out late at night, gets his pants, comes back, and goes to sleep very shaken. Something key that happens in part 1 of the book, it also happens in part 2, but something key in part 1 is that Lee sets up the expectation that Jem and Scout are going through different periods of life. So Jem is growing up and kind of pulling away from Scout in certain ways, and Scout wants to hang on to that or doesn't understand quite what's happening. And in this case, in almost every chapter, there's something that happens that shows us that there's a changing relationship between the two of them. In this one, it's that Jem doesn't tell her what frightened him when he picked up his pants, and he didn't tell her when he wanted to do the prank. So it's just life changes. I have a brother who's 4 years younger than me, so it's kind of fun for me to read this book because I feel like I got to be in his shoes a little bit. Of course, I was much cooler, but that might be biased. Anyway, let's move on. In the next chapter, it's mostly Jem and Scout finding things in the tree. They find a ball of twine. They find some figurines of soap that are shaped to look like them too. And they find a pocket watch and more gum. And one morning walking by, they don't find anything because instead of any gift in there, it's only cement. Someone has filled the hole with the cement. Jem turns to Nathan and says, "Why did you fill the hole with cement?" And Nathan says, "Oh, because it's dying, and when it's dying, you have to fill it with cement." And Jem runs home and asks Atticus, "Do you do that for a dead tree? Is it dying?" And Atticus says, "No." And Jem starts to cry. Scout doesn't quite get it, but I do, so I can tell you why he starts crying. Jem starts crying, I think, because he understands it's Boo Radley giving him these gifts, and he also understands that Nathan lied to him, and that the reason why he's filling the hole is because he doesn't want Boo giving them gifts anymore. And I think that it's just kind of cruel to take that away from a man who's trying to give gifts to kids. And so I think Jem is hurt by that this little old Boo is just trying to be friendly and that's taken away from him. On a winter's day, it snows. It's very cute because I feel like it's very accurate for Texas snow, where it snows a little bit and gets really slushy and there's maybe like an inch on the ground and everyone is super excited because you never get to see snow. But it starts to snow. Scout is even like, "Oh my God, we're dying." And Atticus is like, "No, it's snow." And they go out and they try to make a snowman, but there's not enough snow. So what Jem does is he puts a bunch of mud together and then he puts snow on top of the mud and shapes it to look like one of their neighbors, Mr. Avery. Atticus finds that hilarious because apparently it's really accurate and they have to change it a little bit so that it's not so obviously Mr. Avery. And they make their little snowman and their neighbor Miss Maudie is like, "You guys, what are you doing?" And then they go to bed. Sadly, things go wrong in the night. Scout wakes up because Atticus is telling her to get on her shoes, they have to go. And they go out to the street and it seems like Miss Maudie's house is on fire. It's freezing outside and Scout and Jem stand back while they watch the firefighters try and put down the fire that is at Miss Maudie's house. Atticus stands next to Miss Maudie, but he sends the kids to go stand next to Bradley Place. And they're freezing and tiptoeing back and forth, and Scout's really worried, but Jem says, "Don't be worried, Atticus isn't worried, so it's fine." Eventually, they calm the flames and they go inside. Inside, Atticus is actually a little upset. He says, "Hey, didn't I tell you guys not to move?" And they're both like, "Well, we didn't." And he's like, "Well, whose blanket is that?" And they look down and Scout realizes that there's a blanket on her. And she says, I don't know, Atticus. I swear I didn't move." And suddenly it occurs to both Atticus and Jem that Boo Radley came out while they weren't paying attention and put a blanket around their shoulders, which is very cute. And suddenly Jem pours out his heart, tells Atticus all about the gifts they've been receiving, and tells Atticus that we can't give the blanket back because he doesn't want to get Boo in trouble with Nathan. Atticus completely understands. Scout doesn't quite understand what's going on here. She doesn't know why Jem confesses all these things. She doesn't get it, but I do because I'm not 8. Honestly, this point in the story with the fire and Boo coming outside and the next bit that we're about to see happen is the part where the story finally starts warming up a little bit. Up until now, while I enjoyed the characters and they had funny shenanigans, I wasn't quite sure where we were going and there wasn't really an issue to read about. And I find myself sometimes having trouble focusing on those parts of books where it's just groundwork. It's necessary groundwork, but the groundwork is not very exciting. So now we're finally into more of the meat of the story in the next chapter. And now we're on to the meat of the story, which is Atticus defending a black man in court. We haven't reached the part where he's actually in the court, but we've reached the part where the town is hearing about it and where it's starting to affect Scout because people at school start to taunt her about her father a bit. And when she asks him about it, he tells her he is defending a man named Tom Robinson, because if he didn't defend this man, then he'd be a hypocrite and he wouldn't be able to hold his head up and tell her and Jem what to do. And he also tells her, when people say mean things to you, don't fight them. Like, hold your head up high, and it's not worth it. Scout takes this to heart and really tries not to do it with her classmates, but that all falls apart when they go to spend Christmas with her family. They really like Christmas because their Uncle Jack comes to visit, but they dislike Christmas because they have to spend it with their Aunt Alexandra. Uncle Jack does come to visit and brings them their presents, which are 2 air rifles from Atticus and Uncle Jack. And during this time, Scout is trying to rebel against school by using common words to show that she shouldn't be there because she's learning bad habits. So she's using words like damn and hell. And while he's there, Uncle Jack says, look, don't use those words or consequences will occur. And she understands it. At Christmas, she is talking to her cousin Frances, who is in general just being rude, and is telling her that her father is destroying the Finch family name and calls him an N-word lover and really makes her crazy. So he runs away, and then he comes back again and taunts her again and calls her dad names. And so, losing her cool, she punches him in the face, which is utterly hilarious. Hearing the commotion, her Aunt Alexandra and Uncle Jack come outside, and when Uncle Jack asks her what happened, she says, I don't have anything to say. And when her aunt asks Frances what happened, Frances says that she called him a whore lady, and then she punched him. For this, Uncle Jack immediately flips her over onto his knee and spanks her 8 times. She says she hates him. They get home. She runs to her room. She ignores him. Fair, honestly. That night, she tells Jack why he shouldn't have spanked her, which is really hilarious. She explains that he didn't even let her explain her side and tells him what Frances said. And Uncle Jack is really upset about it. He's ready to go yell at Frances. And she tells him, don't actually. Atticus asked me not to fight, and I really don't want to disappoint him. And she overhears Jack and Atticus talking, and overhears Atticus saying that it was going to be a tough time with this case, and that he hopes that the children listen to him rather than listen to the town. Of course, Atticus knows she's there. In the next chapter, we get the title of the book. Atticus tells the kids, feel free to use their air rifles with blue jays, but don't shoot mockingbirds because it's a sin. Later, Scout asks Maudie why it's a sin, and Maudie says it's because mockingbirds don't do anything but sing, so it's cruel to shoot them. Also in this chapter, there's only a couple of big things that happen, so I'm going to tell you the 2 big things that happen. The first is that there's a mad dog. Jem and Scout see this mad dog walking down the street. I'm assuming it's rabies, because they just use the word mad. I'm assuming it's rabies. They see this dog and they go inside, tell Calpurnia. Calpurnia calls the emergency services, otherwise known as Heck Tate, or the sheriff of the town. And she goes around to all the houses, including the Radleys, and tells them to stay inside. Atticus gets home and Heck Tate, the sheriff, arrives and tells Atticus to shoot the dog. He says, look, the Radley house is right behind that dog. I'm a terrible shot. I'll miss the dog. Please go shoot the dog. And apparently, Atticus is an amazing shot and has never told his kids this. He goes out into the middle of the street, stands there, adjusts his glasses, and they fall to the ground. And he still raises the gun to his shoulder, shoots, and hits the dog right in the forehead. And it's amazing. Both of the kids are amazed. They're like, whoa. The other big thing that happens in this section of the book is this little old lady who sits on the street just constantly says really mean things to Jem and Scout when they walk by. She calls their dad names. She calls them names. It's really uncool. And in any case, one day, Jem loses his cool and destroys all her flower bushes. And Atticus forces him to go over and talk to the lady and apologize. She requires that he come over to read to her every afternoon for a set amount of time, which he does with Scout. And at the end of these reading times, she has fits. And then they leave. At the end of the chapter, we find out that her name, Mrs. Dubose, she has passed away. And Atticus finally explains to Jem and Scout what was going on. He says that Mrs. Dubose was a morphine addict and that she had been given just a little while to live, and in her last couple months had decided to end her life free from morphine. And so she was trying to cut herself off. And every day Jem would come over and read, she would set like a timer a little further, like time-wise, and spend more time without morphine, which is pretty wild. And so Atticus says that that's one of the bravest things he's ever seen, despite how awful she was. She was a brave and courageous person, and that's what he wanted the kids to take away, which is very cute. And we're on to part 2 of the book. Part 1 is not uninteresting or boring because things happen there. It's mostly just that we are experiencing life in like a little kid's world, and sometimes that can just get boring, even with interesting activities that are occurring. But part 1 is important, I think, because first of all, it sets up the town and the setting, because what's really important in part 2, I believe, is what the trial reflects about the town. And so in order for us to understand that, we have to understand the town and the people in it and how it works. After part 1, we know that Miss Maudie is someone who has some money because she's not so worried about material possessions. We know that the Finches think of themselves as better than the Cunninghams because the Cunninghams have less money, and that everyone is better than the Ewells because they live in like the dump. And lastly, we see that the white community of Maycomb think of themselves as better than the black community. And we will really see that in part 2. In part 1, it's almost like we're seeing how the white community interacts with each other. But in part 2, we'll still see that, but now race relations are much more a part of it and much more part of Scout's knowledge. So let's move on. Let's start with part 2. Part 2 moves slower than part 1 because part 1 is supposed to set up the town. So we follow 2 years of Scout's life in part 1, and in part 2 is just the summer of her 8th year. So we're gonna jump in. Basically, she tells us Jem is 12, and this summer Dill is not here. And we also learn that Atticus isn't here. For 2 weeks, he's gone to some sort of session, and Calpurnia is watching them. So this Sunday, Calpurnia takes them to her church. She dresses them up, and she sees the congregation. Some of them are upset about the children being there, but some of them are fine with it. And they sing hymns, and Sykes the Reverend forces the congregation to give them $10 for Tom Robinson's wife, who Scout is like, oh, I know that guy. That's the guy that Atticus is representing. And after the service, on their way home, they see their Aunt Alexandra just chilling on the porch. And they're like, what is she doing here? Because we love her, right, folks? We learn that Atticus has asked her to help him out. I'm guessing because this summer's going to be really difficult and he wants a presence in the kids' lives. And we get some information about how their aunt is fitting in town. It sounds like she fits in great. She talks to the ladies and she goes to tea and she's very fancy and she dislikes Scout's whole vibe. She hates that she's not a lady and she's wearing overalls and she dislikes all of that. And she finds that the kids don't know how to do anything, and she tells Atticus that they should know where their family comes from and act like proper Finches. So Atticus confronts his children about it and tells them they need to be proper Finches, and Scout makes a noise with like a hair comb and he says, don't do that, it's noisy, and she starts to cry and she's like, I don't know how to be a Finch, like, is that gonna be something I have to remember? And he instantly feels terrible and is like, it's okay, don't worry about it. One day, Scout asks Atticus what rape is. This is because Calpurnia had mentioned to her at the church that that was the reason why Tom Robinson was in trouble. Atticus explains it to the best of his ability while being, a gentleman. And her aunt gets upset whenever Scout asks if she can go to hang out with Calpurnia and in general spend more time with her. Her aunt gets upset. Her aunt wants Atticus to fire Calpurnia. Atticus says no. Jem and Scout fight. And that night, surprise, surprise, Dill shows up at their house because he has run away from home and wants to spend the summer in Maycomb. They call his aunt and his family and work it out, and Dill is staying for the summer. So for the next half of the pod, we're going to get into some tricky subjects because that's what the book goes over. So if you're uncomfortable with those, feel free to skip ahead, but I am going to tell you what happens in the book because that's this book club. So anyway, in the next scene that's important, we see that a group of men are approaching Atticus outside his home and telling Atticus something about how they're moving Tom Robinson, how they're feeling uneasy, how the men can get out of hand sometimes, and Atticus comes back in. Later that night, Atticus gathers up his things and takes the car and drives away. Now the kids are like, okay, Atticus never takes the car. What's going on? So they follow Atticus. They follow him in his car, just walking, and they find him sitting at the county jail. From Scout's perspective, as a reader, we understand that Tom Robinson has been moved to the county jail, and that Atticus is obviously worried that some people are going to come and hurt Tom Robinson. So he's sitting and reading. They watch Atticus sit while 4 cars drive up next to him. A bunch of men get out of their cars and surround Atticus and say, "Look, is he in there?" And actually, this is a really cute moment, but Atticus tells them, "Yes, he's asleep. Keep your voices down." And so for the rest of this communication, they're all whispering, which it's a serious subject, but it kind of makes me laugh because it shows that while they're a mob at the moment, they still respect Atticus, which is so funny. But anyway, they're talking, and it's clear that these men are here to lynch Tom Robinson, which is really heavy. Of course, Scout does not understand that that is what's happening, and at some point in the conversation, she runs forward, and Atticus sees her and is obviously scared because now there's an 8-year-old here, his daughter, and she's standing there, and Jem is standing there, and Dill is standing there, and the men try to get the kids to leave. So they're saying, "Jem, get out of here." Jem says no, and a guy grabs Jem by the collar, tries to hoist him up. Scout kicks that guy, and Atticus is like, "Stop kicking people." And then something pretty adorable happens where Scout, not understanding what's going on, just sees someone she recognizes in the crowd. She sees Mr. Cunningham, or Walter Cunningham's father. And knowing him and how Atticus has worked for entailments, she says, "Oh, Mr. Cunningham, how's the entailment coming?" And he doesn't answer her, and she doesn't quite understand why. So she says, "Okay, well, how is Walter? I know Walter from school. I beat him up once, but he was really cool about it. How is he doing?" And he still doesn't respond to her, so she feels like she's doing something wrong, and she switches back to entailments because Atticus told her that she should talk about whatever the other person's interested in talking about. So she's like, "Well, entailments are bad, right?" And in the middle of talking, she realizes that everyone is staring at her with their mouths kind of open, and she's really confused, and she's like, "What's wrong?" And suddenly Mr. Cunningham stoops down and says, "I'll tell him you said hi. Men, let's go." And they all leave. So what essentially happened there is that Scout kind of singled someone out in the crowd and reminded him that they are friends and that she knows him and that this little kid is here and obviously doesn't understand what's going on, and they're not gonna hurt someone in front of this little girl. So they abandon their goal of killing this poor man, who speaks out for the first time in the book. He says, "Are they gone?" Atticus says, "Yes, try to get some sleep." It's a really heavy chapter, and we start to get a stronger feel for the feelings of the town, which is that they are not happy about this man being here. They are not happy about the crime he supposedly committed, and they are not happy with Atticus for defending him. In this moment, Tom isn't really present for it because he's in the jail. He's being quiet. I'm sure Atticus told him to be that way. As a reader, you worry more for Atticus in the moment than you do for Tom because you're reading through the eyes of Scout, and Atticus is her father. And so I'm going to talk more about that at the end in our discussion, but I just wanted to mention that that's why we're more worried for Atticus in this moment than Tom Robinson, who is the real victim here. So let's move on. The next part of the book is the trial of Tom Robinson. Now, I'm going to move fairly quickly through it because it is one day in a trial, but if you ever have the chance to read this book, this part was my favorite because I think Harper Lee really builds the emotion in the room. I think she builds on the suspense. I had to Google whether this poor man would be found guilty or not because I couldn't stand it. I was like, I just need to know because it's too much. So she builds it so well, and you really feel the room even though you're not there. It's a crazy experience, but I'm still going to tell you what happens. Hopefully you get that feeling from me. Anyway, the trial. That morning, Jem and Scout notice that there's a ton of people going into town. Obviously, the whole town is going to watch this trial. It's an important moment in history that they all want to watch. Jem and Scout are told to not go. And after lunch, what do you think they do? Why, they go, of course. They show up, and it's so packed that they can't find any seats. So what ends up happening is Reverend Sykes from Calpurnia's church offers them a seat in their section, and they sit with the reverend to watch the trial. Atticus does not know they're there, and they watch it for the rest of the afternoon. What happens is the testimonies of each person involved. So I'm going to just tell you the testimony of each person, and the reaction of both Jem and Scout for each of these testimonies is that Jem is very positive that Tom will be acquitted, and Scout is not so sure. And that's all they feel, just increasingly so, through the testimonies. So let me lay out these testimonies for you. The first is by Hecate, or the sheriff. He mentions that on November 21st, Bob Ewell found him and brought him to his home because, quote unquote, an N raped his daughter. Now, from this point, I'm just going to say Tom instead of that, but assume that these white people from the 30s are saying the N-word mostly. But anyway, he says Tom raped his daughter. Atticus asks why a doctor wasn't brought to the scene, and Hecate doesn't know. He can't answer him. After some more questioning, Atticus is able to discern that the girl supposedly was punched in the right eye. Hecate testifies to it and then steps down. Bob Ewell is the next to testify, and Atticus asks him basically the same questions. He says, why wasn't a doctor called? And are you sure it was her right eye that was punched? And he says yes to both. He also asks, basically what happened that evening. He heard his daughter screaming. He showed up. Tom ran away. And that's what happened. And then he got Hecate. Atticus also makes sure to ask that Bob is left-handed. And Bob says he is. And he is also, by the way, terrible on the stand. He's responding in rude ways and being in general, not a very good witness. In any case, he says he is left-handed. And Atticus also double checks and says, was there bruising around her neck? Because you guys claim that she was choked. And they say, yeah, she was choked from behind. There's bruising consistent with it. And so Atticus says, great, no more questions. And Bob steps down, or is supposed to, and instead stands up and points at Tom and says, that man, hurt my daughter. And the whole courtroom goes crazy. And Judge Taylor has to, calm everyone down and take a quick recess. At the time, I thought that Atticus was asking for a doctor because there's no actual evidence that anything happened to his daughter because a doctor wasn't called. But what I'm thinking also happens, and what he's trying to imply, is why didn't you get a doctor for your daughter who was hurt, supposedly? If you were concerned, why did you not get a doctor? And I think you'll see what he's implying in a second. So next to the stand is the girl herself. Her name is Mayella, and her story is all over the place. Atticus can't quite get a straight answer from her. She's crying at first, and then he calls her Miss, and she thinks that Atticus is mocking her when he's just being a gentleman. And she's just really upset, changing her story. But basically her story is she asked Tom to come in and chop up a chiffon robe, which I'm assuming is some sort of armoire of some kind, and that when he got in there, he trapped her and hurt her and took advantage of her until her father showed up. But Atticus has to ask questions okay, but when did he choke you? When did he beat you? And she doesn't know. And then she lands on, oh yeah, this time, I just remembered, and stuff like that. After she's done telling her story, Atticus asks Tom to stand up because, shockingly to me as a reader, and also to Scout, Tom has a disabled arm. It's kind of hanging limply at his side, and Reverend Sykes says that it was caught in a cotton gin when he was younger, and it's even shorter than the other arm. It's clearly not a usable arm that you could punch someone with. So Atticus asks Mayella, how did he do this? And Mayella doesn't really have an answer. And this is where Atticus kind of cuts in and says, are you sure this happened? Are you sure that Bob, your father, was not the one who hit you and choked you? Because this seems ridiculous. There's no way Tom was able to do this. And she just freaks out and says, no, my dad's never laid a hand on me. It was definitely Tom, and starts crying and sobbing and crying and sobbing. It's all very dramatic. Tom's testimony is last. He tries to swear himself in, but his hand has trouble staying on the book, and it's kind of sad. And the judge tells him, it's okay, I'll accept that. And so he sits down and he tells his side of the story, which is that he has done odd jobs for Miss Mayola in the past because she's on his way home. And she's always kind of lonely and sad, and the other people don't help her much. So he has done odd jobs for her when he can. So on this particular day, he was walking home, and she asked him to fix a door inside. So he went inside to see the door, and she basically jumped him and started like hugging him and doing all these inappropriate things. And he freaked out and tried to get away. And this is when Bob came in and he ran. And he says that he ran because he was scared. And they ask why. And he said, well, because of this situation, I didn't want to be tried for something I didn't do, which is really heavy. This is when Mr. Link D's, his employer, Tom's employer, stands up and says, Tom's always been a good worker and has never caused me trouble. And the judge gets really mad and has him thrown out. But it's still something that, like, the jury sees. This is where Atticus gives his closing statements. He takes it very seriously and, like, honestly, earnestly is speaking to the jury. He says, look, we all know what's happening here, right? Like, this woman came on to Tom and then realized that she had broken like a code in our society in the 1930s and then felt incredible guilt and shame about it. And she's trying to get it as far away from her as possible. And he goes on to say that while most men are created equal, according to Thomas Jefferson, that there are some things that men are good at and women are good at, and we're all different people. But the ideal thing that treats every person the same should be the American court. And he has this whole thing about it, and he sends them into the room to deliberate. This is when Calpurnia arrives with a note saying that his kids are missing, and he's like, oh my God. And the judge is like, no, I see them, they're up there. And Atticus is like, ugh. And he tells the kids that if they go home for dinner, they can come back to learn what the verdict was. They go home for dinner, obviously, and they come back to learn what the verdict was, obviously. And while they're sitting, Jem is very certain that he will be acquitted. And Atticus and Scout are both more unsure about it. And eventually the jury comes out after like a really long time. And Scout mentions that a jury that convicts the person doesn't look at him. So the jury is avoiding looking at Tom, and she knows that it's going to be a guilty verdict. And it is. They say that he's guilty and he's sent to prison. And Jem is just heartbroken about it. And Atticus says, well, I mean, we made a baby step because, like, we made them think about it at least, right? But he thinks he has a really strong case for acquittal. So they go home, and the next morning there's a really cute scene where a lot of the Black community has dropped off like a gift of food for Atticus and the family, and he like cries and is really grateful for it, which is really cute. And that's the trial of Tom Robinson, which is a real big bummer. And I'm going to talk more about that in our discussion at the end of the episode. But after the trial, Jem is having trouble coming to terms with what this means for himself, for the town, for race relations. He's extremely disappointed and it doesn't make sense. And he wants to make a change and doesn't know how. And he and Atticus have several conversations about it. And he and Scout have several tiffs about it because Scout doesn't quite get it and Jem is really short with her. So anyway, after that, there's a tea party. Her aunt throws a tea party for all the girls in town. And while they're there, there's some uncomfy talk about how their cooks aren't they're sulking, which is uncool. And Maudie's like, yeah, but the food tastes good, right? And kind of puts them in their place a teeny bit. And her aunt looks grateful that she did that. Scout is there, and they're calling her Jean Louise, and she's wearing a dress. And they ask, where are your breeches, Jean Louise? And she says, under my dress. And they all laugh, and she's confused because she's serious. And Miss Maudie gives her hand a little squeeze, which is very cute. I really appreciate that because it's fun to have a female character who is a little different from society. A lot of main characters are that way, to be fair, but it's fun to watch her want to be something different and kind of watch her be supported in that choice. It's very adorable. So let's move on. Anyway, Atticus arrives at this tea party and he talks to Calpurnia and to her aunt, and he tells them that Tom Robinson tried to escape from prison and was shot 17 times, which is a huge bummer. And he asked Calpurnia to come with him to tell his wife, Helen. And so they go and tell her, and Scout sits with the rest of the ladies and tries to pretend like everything is normal with her aunt. And it's a real heavy scene. In the next chapter, Jem tells us that he and Dill saw them tell her because they were picked up on the way, and that she just crumpled to the ground, and it was really sad. It's a heavy moment. We then get an update about Bob Ewell. Apparently, the only two interesting things that happen is that he gets a job, and then he's immediately fired. And the other thing is that he was seen skulking around Judge Taylor's house, which Atticus isn't super worried about. But we also hear that, I neglected to mention this, but before the tea party, Bob came up to Atticus and spit in his face and promised that he'd get him. Right? So Atticus doesn't seem worried about this. He tells the kids, like, he got it out of his system. Don't worry about it. And then the kids don't worry about it. They move on. They move on to Halloween, where a woman in the town has created like a pageant that Scout is going to be in. It's like a food pageant, I guess. And so her job is to be pork and to come on stage in a little pork costume and sing pork and be part of the pageant. And she is really excited for it and does her little bit for her family. And they are supposed to go to the school to do it. So Jem goes with Scout to the school. On the way there, their friend Cecil pops out of the trees and scares them. And they're like, Cecil, goodness. And then they go on about their day and they go to the play. And it's really cute because Scout gets tired in her little costume that looks like a ham, which is like so random. Like, what in your life makes you think that, like, oh, in this part of the book, we'll just have Scout dressed as a ham? It made me laugh, like, in bed in the middle of the night. She's in, like, this costume of chicken wire and brown cloth. And anyway, apparently she falls asleep in her ham costume backstage, so when it's time for her to come on, she doesn't, and she comes on really late, which is so good. But after the play, she and Jem had a good night. They're walking home. On the way home, they realize that something is off. First of all, Scout forgot her shoes. And she'll go back and get them tomorrow. But second of all, Jem thinks he's hearing someone behind them. They think it's Cecil. So they say, Cecil, like, stop. And yet, it doesn't stop. They keep walking, and the steps behind them stop when they stop, which is super creepy. And then, one time, they stop walking, and the steps don't stop. The kids are being attacked. Now, please remember that Scout is in a chicken wire ham costume and she can't see that well because it's really dark. So I'm going to tell you exactly what happens from Scout's point of view, which is really limited because she's kind of enshrouded in a giant ham costume. She says that something crushes her costume. She feels arms around her. She feels like she's being crushed. And Jem says, run. So they start running. Eventually, she hears Jem being tackled, and she hears a scream and a crunch sound. She then feels something attacking her again, crushing her as tight as possible. And she feels something take that force away. So something grabs the guy who's crushing her and pulls him down. And then she hears someone wheezing. She's able to roll over and try and see what's going on. And she's feeling all around, and she touches like a man on the ground, and she touches stubble, and he smells like whiskey. And she's like, that's not Jem. And she stands up eventually, is able to see this old man carrying Jem down the street to their house. It's good to tell you that the school is not very far, and they were in like a tree grove right near their house. So this old man can carry Jem to their house. When they get there, Jem gets there first. They freak out, call the doctor, the sheriff. Her aunt is there, Atticus is there, Calpurnia is there. The old man takes Jem upstairs, and Aunt Alexandra helps Scout get out of her costume. She puts her in overalls, and then the doctor arrives, and Scout's like, is he dead? And the doctor is like, no, he's not dead. And she goes up to see that, in fact, he's not dead. Now, this is when Sheriff Hecate arrives and asks them what happened. Scout relates the tale as quickly and easily as she can, and she realizes, like, the crunch sound we heard was Jem's arm. She realizes what's going on, and this is when Hecate tells them that this was an attack by Bob Ewell, and the reason he knows is because Bob Ewell is dead. And they're shocked. This is when Atticus is just flabbergasted that anyone could do this. And this is also when Scout realizes that the old man in the room is Boo Radley. It's Arthur Radley, and she begins to cry because it's Boo. She finally gets to meet him, which is so cute. Boo continues to stand in the corner while Atticus and Hecate talk. Eventually, they decide to go down to the porch, and Hecate and Atticus have this argument because Atticus insists that Jeb killed Ewell. Tate insists that Ewell killed himself. He fell on his own knife. He mentions that it was a kitchen knife. He found a switchblade, but he fell on a kitchen knife. And Atticus insists that Jem needs to, fess up for it. And this is where Hecate says, Atticus, just let the dead bury the dead, okay? This is done. We're over. I'm leaving now. And so Hecate leaves. And this is where cute Scout takes Arthur, or Boo, and says, oh, do you need to go? Say goodbye to Jem first, and walks him to Jem's room and introduces him, even though he's unconscious, and walks him to the door. And Boo turns to her and says, will you walk me home? And she said, sure, except she knows it's inappropriate for a lady to walk a man home. So she makes it look like he's escorting her. And they walk to his house, and she drops him off, and he goes inside. And Scout stands on his porch and imagines everything that has happened. So she imagines, as Arthur, watching these kids roll around in your yard and stop by and pick up gifts. And she says that Atticus' saying of how you should step into a person's skin and walk around is really true. And that night she goes home and Atticus reads her a scary story and she falls asleep. He says, okay, let's go to bed now. And she says, no, I was listening. The kids caught up to him and it turns out the bad guy didn't do anything wrong and he was really nice. And Atticus says, turns out most people are when you get to know them. And that's the end. It's so cute. It's adorable. This book was such a surprise for me. I enjoyed it way more than I thought I would. I thought it was going to be so boring. And to be fair, the beginning's a bit slow, but it was so great. So now that I'm still over time, why don't I just continue to tell you my ideas? Let's get into some of our discussion. Creepy houses, fires, mad dogs, trials, and attacks in the nighttime. This book has quite a lot for a main character that's supposed to be 6 to 8 years old, but I really enjoyed it. Like I said, it's a little slow at the beginning, but it really picks up speed, and it's one of those books that reminds me of Little Women. It has that sentimentalism feel, which, if you didn't know, sentimentalism is a branch of Romanticism, which is a literary movement in after the Enlightenment. It basically was this whole thing where you wrote really sweet and heartwarming stories. It's a very cute period of writing time. It includes books like Little Women. And this book reminds me of Little Women in a way because a lot of it is the family and Atticus and Jem and Scout interacting with each other and caring for each other. And it's really adorable. I like it a lot. So let's jump into our discussion. Let me give you some pros about it. I love Lee's characterization. All her characters are so vivid. They jump off the page. I really like them. I love Scout. I love Jem. I love Boo Radley at the very end. He pops in for a second. I like Calpurnia. I like all these people that we meet feel very real, and I like them a lot. I also really like Scout's voice. I like how she understands what's happening but doesn't, because that's really accurate for children for me. Unlike August in Wonder, where I felt like he always knew exactly what was happening, she understands maybe intentions, but she doesn't understand the events, which I think is really accurate, because when you're a kid, you know if someone's being mean, but you might not understand why they're being mean. And so that's a lot of this book. She knows that someone is doing something wrong, but she doesn't know why they're doing it. She knows that her dad is defending Tom Robinson, but she doesn't understand why. So that heart of being a child, I think, is captured really well in this book. And I just really enjoyed it. Other pros, I think, are the pacing. The book moves really quickly. Each chapter has at least one interesting event, Her setting is really well done. All of her settings and locations are really clear to me. The voice of Scout is so strong. There's just a lot of things I really enjoyed about the writing of the novel and even the content. So let's talk about why it's called To Kill a Mockingbird and how that factors in. So I don't know if you remember, but when Atticus gives them the rifles, he says, "Don't kill mockingbirds because they only sing. They don't do anything wrong." And I think that that is the heart of this novel. It's about having power over another creature and not abusing that power. Some people do not use their power well, and some people do. Like Atticus has more power in the town, and he tries to use his power for good in this instance. But like people like Bob Ewell use their power to hurt others, and people who kill mockingbirds use their power to hurt creatures. It's why Atticus doesn't shoot anymore, because that power can't be fought against. So this book is really heady with that feeling all throughout it of how there's always someone below you, but that doesn't mean that you can mistreat them. And in fact, you should probably treat them with more respect. And it's evident even from the very beginning when they invite Walter Cunningham for lunch and she makes a little jab at him about the syrup he's using. And Calpurnia says, look, just because he's poor does not mean he's not company. And in any case, you should probably treat him better. There's the case of Scout herself being among the women. They kind of treat her lesser than, even though she's still a girl, she just doesn't act like it as much. And some of them are not nice to Scout and kind of abuse that power. And even her aunt starts off that way and then changes as the book goes on to kind of respect Scout and understand her ways and her character. Boo Radley is a mockingbird because Nathan has power over him, and almost every creature probably has power over Boo Radley, and yet he hasn't done anything wrong. He just lives in peace. And then there's the ultimate mockingbird, which is Tom Robinson, who did nothing except live his life and then got attacked for it. He's done nothing wrong, and this town turned against him in order to defend a white woman who lost her mind. To me, it's kind of like the message that maybe Wonder was shooting for. Wonder went for kindness, and this one went for, look, we all intrinsically hold power, and it's our responsibility to use it wisely. And I like that fullness in the message, and I think it's really well done. I think it's really well put in the book. One last pro that I really love is the unreliable narrator and the child narrator. I often forget that you can do this. Like writing, I just forget this is like a thing that people do. But to put the events on someone else and then make the narrator someone who's an observer is a classic option. Books like Great Gatsby do it all the time. And I forget that it's something you can do. And I really like it when you do it because it means there's more ambiguity in the story. It means that it's almost like we're there because we're an observer. Someone else writing this novel might have thought, let's be in the head of Atticus Finch or Tom Robinson. But we get a much more interesting point of view from Scout because Scout is trying to understand the world around her and she doesn't quite get it yet. And there's a lot more that Scout doesn't understand that we have to figure out as a reader that makes the world seem real, makes the world seem complicated. And I think that's the whole message that she's trying to tell is that the world is complicated. I really like that she's an unreliable narrator. And I think that no part proves it more than the very end because we end the book with Bob dying and we don't know how it happens because we were in the body of Scout who didn't see what happened. And personally, I'm pretty sure that Boo Radley killed Ewell because it seems like Jem got tossed to the ground and his arm was broken and then the attacker attacked Scout. And I don't know why you'd move from Jem to Scout unless Jem was knocked out. And then someone pulled Bob away and then he died. And then there was like a wheezing man. And only Scout knows that and no one else really does. And even Scout doesn't quite know for sure. And there's a lot of ambiguity in the last couple pages that as a reader is really exciting. I like vagueness in a story because it makes it seem real. Everyone has a different perspective. So it's fun to get really into that. I really enjoyed it. Before I let you go, let me talk to you about the one con that I have for this story. I don't have a lot of cons. I feel like it was written really well, and I feel like I really liked the message of kindness and responsibility. I liked Scout as a character. I really enjoyed a lot of things about this book, and it was just a fun read. But the one thing that holds me back from saying that this book is a 10 out of 10 is its racial message. We live in a time right now of activism and Black Lives Matter and a really great movement. And it's opened my eyes more to what's happening in the world and what has been happening in the world for a really long time. This book is good, but I think it can also be a white savior novel. This book puts Atticus in the role of hero and good guy, and a lot of our Black characters fall into the background or seem one-dimensional. And while I'm sure that was kind of the experience of Scout at the time, I think that for it to be a book that makes a statement about racial differences and justice, you have to include the perspective of the oppressed peoples. So, To Kill a Mockingbird, as much as I enjoyed it, isn't perfect. Most books aren't. I just want to point that out because this is a book that's taught in America every single year and is pointed to as an amazing example. And I just think it's good to read every book with a grain of salt about what it might do better, because I think that it leaves you with more questions, it makes you a better thinker. Just read it with a grain of salt. Know that it was written in 1960. Know that it was an attempt from the voice of a white woman, and you'll enjoy the story for what it is. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. I had the best time talking to you about To Kill a Mockingbird, and I'll see you next week for our episode on Where the Crawdads Sing. I'm super excited to talk about that one. If you want more Bad Book Club, you can find us on all of social media at Bad Book Club Pod. Please, if you enjoyed today's episode, rate and review us on iTunes or whatever listening app you use. It really helps the podcast get noticed, and I would love you forever. And if you're interested in buying a book that I've talked about, you can go to my website and buy from that list, and you can support a local bookstore in the process, which is pretty cool beans. Anyway, thank you for tuning in, and I love you guys, and I'll see you next week. Bye, lovelies!